The Passing of Eric Holm by August Derleth, narrated by Tom Buick for the Cosmic and Body Horror channel. Eric Holm, in common with millions of other human beings, might have been fittingly and completely biographed by saying of him that he was born and presently died. Indeed, so it might well have been with him, had not his passing been so extraordinary. The facts of his life may be summed up briefly enough. He was a childless widower living on a secure income. In person, he was a colourless little man, about whom the only distinguishing thing was an absurdly inexcusable moustache, the incongruity of which in his pallid face had penetrated even the thick-headedness of the corner policeman whom Holm passed at least once daily on his way home from the newsstand. But certainly that policeman did not realise, when he saw Holm returning to his residence on the afternoon of April the 3rd, 1939, that the package which Holm was carrying beneath his arm was anything but a harmless and unassuming purchase. Yet, at the rather astonishing inquest, Jeremy Lansing, apparently Holm's only friend, inferred that Holm was on that fateful afternoon carrying beneath his arm his death, when Lansing declared that Holm died because he bought a book. The policeman admitted that on that afternoon, the last Holm had been seen alive by anyone save Lansing, Holm had certainly been carrying a package which looked like a very carefully wrapped book. The matter was virtually placed beyond all doubt when Mr. Sanderton of Sanderton and Hawker, book importers, came forward and stated that Holm had been on the afternoon of April the 3rd bought a book in their 4th Avenue store. The title of the book was simply Confessions of the Mad Monk Clythanus, a priceless and rare volume, which, owing to the present economic crisis, Sanderton and Harker had let go at a very moderate price. Apart from the policeman and Sanderton, there were 2 other witnesses at the inquest. One was a young man who gave his name as Johnny Heckler, whose rather garbled story of having seen some vague and frightening things slide over the wall of Holm's garden was at first discounted owing to the young man's reputation for too frequent attentions to a constant and well-filled companion in his hip pocket. The other was Lansing, a middle-aged gentleman of sober mien and nautical bearing, considerably supported by his large and bushy sideburns, cut in a fashion for decades out of style. It was Lansing's deposition which split the press, to have half the newspapers calling for his life as the murder of his best friend, and the other half darkly hinting at deep-laid plots by certain representatives of foreign powers, and eventually left the coroner's jury to take press censure for gullibility. Apart from minor persons called to testify the conditions of the finding of Holm's body, Lansing was the last witness called to testify. "Please tell us, Mr. Lansing," asked the coroner, "what you meant by saying that Mr. Holm died because he bought a book." Lansing considered the coroner and the jury for a few moments before replying. Then he spoke. "It was this way, gentlemen," he said. "Mr. Holm had got into the habit of buying quite a lot of books on witchcraft and such matters, and had got quite set on trying out some of those old formulas. We did try out a few, but of course nothing ever happened." A member of the jury rose at this point to request more detailed information regarding the unsuccessful experiments, but the coroner decided that such details would contribute nothing to the matter in hand. Lansing was instructed to continue. "Well, last Monday night, say about 6:30, Holm called me on the telephone," he went on. "You'll remember the night, gentlemen, a muckish night with a bit of fog from the sea. He told me he just bought another book. The real thing this time. There was something worth trying in the book and would have come right over. I said I would, having nothing better to do, so over I went. He had the book all right, Confessions of Clythanus, as Mr. Sanderton has already mentioned. I looked it over. It was supposed to be a book of revelations written by a mad monk somewhere on the coast of England and privately printed. It was fairly old and printed in Latin, though it was easy enough to read for all that. Holm pointed out certain chapters and I looked through them. They concerned something which the monk claimed to have called out of the sea, some kind of queer animal with a funny sort of name. I've forgotten it now, but if I could look at the book for a minute, no doubt I could find it again. The coroner accordingly handed the book to Mr. Lansing, who, after a few moments of diligent search, looked up and announced that he had found it. "It's this," he said, reading "Spawn of Cthulhu from the Sunken Kingdom of R'lyeh." That's the animal, one of the spawn, which Holmes said he could call up from the sea. At this point, a member of the jury rose to express the hope that Lansing would proceed as quickly and as directly as possible to the facts concerning Holmes' death. The coroner instructed Lansing to proceed accordingly, but it was apparent, shortly after Lansing had again taken up his story, that he had not diverged in any detail from his leisurely method. "This animal seems to have been a sort of evil being," so the book said at any rate, and was banished and sent back into the sea by Augustine, then Bishop over Clathanus. The formula for summoning this beast from the sea was given by the monk, who wrote that this beast could be used by a wise man to be sent against his enemies. Holmes proposed that he call this beast up that night and send him out after me. I'd be safe enough, of course, because he'd sent along the monk's formula of protection and of sending the beast back to the place from which it came. Well, gentlemen, naturally I put no faith in the business, especially since so many other trials had come to naught. So I agreed readily enough, though, to tell the truth. I was getting a bit tired of his everlasting experiments that didn't ever work out. We set on the hour of 10 o'clock for the trial. "You mean 10 o'clock that night?" put in the coroner. "Why couldn't it have been better done in the daytime?" "Oh, Mr. Holmes would never experiment in the daytime, you see. He always looked to have one of those experiments come out, and that would never do by day." The coroner nodded. "Well, we sat and talked a bit, he and I, and at 9 o'clock I went home. For the first quarter hour or so, I forgot all about that formula to protect myself, and it wasn't until 5 minutes to 10 that I thought of it. Then I began to repeat the formula." "Have you a copy of the formula?" asked a member of the jury. Lansing nodded. "Yes, it's contained in the book. It's in Old Latin, and it's full of very odd references to ancient gods and such things. It's quite beyond me, of course, but all I had to do was repeat the formula. Well, I was a little over halfway through the thing when I heard something snuffling about near the window of my library. I confess that I got nervous at that, even though I didn't believe in such things, so I hurried the formula a bit. Then I heard my front door open, and a moment later, queer, shuffling footsteps coming down the hall. And believe me, gentlemen, I rattled off that Latin faster than I ever thought I could do it. I got it done just when the noise of something coming down the hall got up to my library door. When I finished reciting that formula, the noise stopped too. I was near to being paralysed with the shock of the thing, so I stood there for a bit and listened. Then I heard the noise again, footsteps going back down the hall and out of the front door. I didn't hear the door close, and when I saw it later, it was standing open. I finally managed to get up my courage and look into the hall. Gentlemen, there was nothing there. But there had been something there, and whatever had been there was soaking wet, because there was a trail of water all over my carpet, in the hall, and nasty-looking footprints. Those in the court looked puzzled as Lansing paused. "What kind of footprints?" asked the coroner. "Oh, nothing I'd ever seen before. Something like a big frog's. Webbed feet, but big, very big and irregular. Yes, gentlemen, most irregular. Believe me, it set me up to see them there, and the smell too. Like the sea. Of course, you knew there was a fog that night, and with the door open, why the smell could have come from that, but it was so strong, and there was something else about it, something animalish." I stood for a few moments looking at the tracks. Then I thought of home, so I pulled myself together and went to the telephone. He was waiting. I guess he answered right away. I said who I was, and then I told him, "I think that beast of yours came all right home. Left a nice mess of wet tracks on my hall carpet, I must say." That's what I said to him. "Did you see it?" he asked me. "Oh no, thanks," I said. "I saw its footprints, and I can still smell it. That's quite enough for me." I could hear him laughing. Then he said, "It's too bad you didn't see it. Tell you what we'll do next time, we'll reverse it. You send it to me. I'll take a look at it before I send it back." Then he paused a bit, and I asked whether there was anything the matter. "There's someone at the door, I think." "Just a minute. Why, by George, I think he's coming right in." Then he went away from the telephone. Lansing paused again, swallowed with some difficulty, and clasped his hands tightly together. Then, gentlemen, then I heard him scream. A terrible scream it was, and I heard furniture being turned over and things being torn, curtains and such like, and then horrid grunting noises, awful little croaks and grunts. Lansing paused again. I called into the telephone, but he didn't answer. No one answered. His man wasn't home. It was his day out anyway. I called, and I could hear something all the time, a nasty, horrid sound, like something eating. Then, gentlemen, I called the police. I met them in front of Holmes' house and went right in with them. The front door was standing open on his waiting room, and, gentlemen, there were tracks there, like those in my hall, wet, nasty tracks that smelled like the deep sea, a slimy seaweed smell. And the tracks went all the way in, through the waiting room and the dining room, and around into the library. There we found Holm. He was dead. He had been sort of pulled to pieces, and he wasn't quite all there. I couldn't look at him, gentlemen, and he my best friend. I couldn't stand in the library either, and got back into the waiting room as quick as I could. The library had a smell 20 times worse than the one in the waiting room. After a while, I went back and showed the police the telephone. It was hanging out of its cradle, just the way he'd left it, and then I picked up the book too. A little later, I went with the police on the trail of those footprints. They went out the back way, through the garden where they dented in the ground, fairly well showing that the thing must have had a good deal of weight, and over the garden wall. From there, they turned seaward, and we lost them. Lansing shuddered and stopped. He looked again from the coroner to the jury, and back again. The coroner appeared to be considering the story. "Of course," he said presently, "you can realise how we react to such a narrative, even with the authentic evidence we seem to have. But there is one thing that puzzles me. You said that Holm would send back with you the formula for your protection and for sending the beast back to the place from which it came. I assumed that Mr. Holm meant that your reciting the formula would send the beast back to the sea." Lansing nodded vigorously. "Oh, yes, absolutely he did. But since the beast appears to have followed the appointed order of the formula, in coming in response to Mr. Holmes' summons, and in being repulsed by your formula, I am at a loss to understand why it did not return directly to the sea instead of going back to destroy Mr. Holm." A breathless silence hung in the room. Lansing fumbled awkwardly in his pockets and drew out a piece of paper twice folded. Then he put on a pair of worn spectacles and peered at the writing on the paper. Following this, he opened up the ancient volume which he still held on his lap. Then he looked up, swept the room with a nervous glance. "I wondered about that too," he said. "I thought that perhaps I had bungled it or something. So I looked it up in the book. The formula, that is, before I turned the book over to you. You see, Holm had written out the formula for me. It's on this piece of paper, just the way I recited it. Now, if you look at the book, you'll see that the original formula for summoning the beast is printed on page 32, and that the formula for sending it back to the sea starts in the bottom of page 33 and is complete on page 34. Then, if you look a little further, you'll see that there's another formula, started on the bottom of page 35 and finished on the top of page 36. If you'll compare the formula started on page 32 with that started on page 35, you'll find that they read exactly alike. When Holm copied that formula out of the book, he turned over 2 leaves instead of 1. While the 2 formulas start exactly alike, they don't end up alike, gentlemen. They're altogether different. The formula he meant to give me was for sending the beast back to the sea. Because in his haste he did not notice that he turned 2 pages, and because they read alike at the beginning, the formula he gave me was for sending the beast back upon the man who had first sent it out. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to volunteer and narrate your favourite story for Cosmic and Body Horror, please contact cosmicandbodyhorror@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this story, you maybe consider donating to the narrator. There's a link to buy me a coffee in the description, or maybe visit some of my other channels, also linked there.